The cold wind howled through the desolate winter night, carrying tiny snowflakes that danced in the air before settling on the frozen ground. Beneath the pale glow of a flickering streetlight, a lone German shepherd moved silently, her paws crunching the snow as she made her way to the same spot she had visited every night for weeks. Her fur was thick, but the frost clinging to her coat hinted at the unforgiving chill that had seeped into the earth. Her deep, soulful eyes carried a weight that spoke of something far beyond simple survival. She paused, looked around as if ensuring no one was watching, and began to dig. Her movements were deliberate yet gentle, as though she feared disturbing something fragile buried beneath. Snow flew in soft bursts around her, and her breath fogged the icy air. The hole she was making wasn't random, it was precise, almost as if she knew exactly where to dig. Her focus was unshakable, but there was a sadness in the way her ears drooped and her tail moved sluggishly behind her. What was she searching for in the frozen ground? A memory, perhaps, a secret no one else knew. From across the street, an older man in a thick wool coat stood silently by his window, his cup of coffee long forgotten in his hand. He had noticed her before, but tonight something felt different. The way she moved, the quiet determination in her eyes. It pulled at him, though he couldn't explain why. Why did she keep coming back to this exact spot every night? What could possibly be here, in the middle of an abandoned park covered in snow? The man set his cup down and sighed, torn between curiosity and his own unease. He wasn't sure if he should approach her. After all, she didn't seem lost or stray. Her well-groomed fur suggested she had a home, perhaps a family waiting for her. Yet here she was in the dead of night, digging a hole in the freezing cold like it was the only thing that mattered. As the man's gaze lingered on the scene, the dog stopped digging and sniffed the ground, her ears twitching at the faintest sound. For a brief moment she looked up, her eyes meeting his through the frosted glass. There was something haunting in that gaze, something that made his chest tighten. She held his stare for a heartbeat longer before lowering her head and resuming her task, as though whatever she was doing was too important to waste time on him. The man felt a strange pull, an urge to step outside and see for himself what was hidden beneath the snow. But something held him back. Was it fear of disturbing her, or fear of what he might discover? He shook his head and turned away, convincing himself it was none of his business. Yet, even as he walked back to his chair, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a dog digging in the snow. There was a story here, one he didn't yet understand. The German shepherd paused again, her paws resting on the edge of the hole. Her eyes softened, and for the first time that night, her head tilted slightly upward, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. A whisper of the past, a voice that guided her, and then, just as quickly as she had started, she stopped, filled the hole with snow and turned to leave, her tail trailing behind her like a shadow. The man stood frozen in his living room, his heart heavy with questions he couldn't answer. What was she looking for? Why did she stop? And why did he feel like this was only the beginning of something far bigger than either of them could comprehend? The next night, the man found himself pacing near the window, waiting. He told himself it wasn't deliberate, just a coincidence that he happened to be there again. But deep down, he knew better. The German shepherd had left a mark on his thoughts that wouldn't fade. When the clock struck 11, just as the quiet of the night set in, he saw her shadow emerge from the darkness. She moved the same way, silent, deliberate, carrying an air of purpose that felt almost human. This time, he couldn't stay inside. Grabbing his coat and scarf, he stepped into the cold night, his boots crunching against the snow as he approached the park. He kept his distance, careful not to scare her away. She didn't seem to notice him at first, too focused on the task at hand. Her paws worked quickly, and the snow piled up around her as she dug deeper and deeper into the earth. "Hey there," the man said softly, his breath visible in the freezing air. His voice broke the stillness, but the dog didn't flinch. She paused for a moment, her ears twitching in his direction, then went back to digging. There was something almost defiant in her behavior, as if to say, "You wouldn't understand." The man crouched a few feet away, his knees brushing the cold ground. "What are you doing out here?" he murmured, his tone gentle, almost as if he were speaking to a child. She glanced at him then, her amber eyes piercing and full of something he couldn't name. Sadness, determination, guilt. He couldn't be sure, but it stirred something in him. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, holding out a gloved hand. I want to help, whatever you're looking for." His words trailed off as she suddenly stopped digging. Her body tensed, and she let out a low, mournful whine, staring down at the hole as if something invisible had struck her. The man leaned closer, peering into the hole. At first, all he saw was snow and dirt. But then, in the dim light of the street lamp, something caught his eye. A small, tattered piece of fabric, faded and worn, clinging to the frozen earth. It looked like a piece of a blanket, frayed at the edges and stained with time. The dog nudged it gently with her nose, her whine growing louder. "What's this?" the man whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of curiosity and dread. He reached out cautiously, but the dog let out a sharp bark, startling him. She didn't bare her teeth or growl, but the message was clear. "Don't touch it." He pulled his hand back, his heart pounding. Okay, he said, raising his hands in surrender. "I won't touch it, but is this what you've been looking for?" The dog sat down beside the hole, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Her eyes never left the fabric, and for a moment the man thought he saw her shiver. Not from the cold, but from something deeper, something rooted in her soul. "You're not just a stray, are you?" he said quietly, his breath forming small clouds in the air. "You've got a story, don't you?" The dog looked up at him then, her gaze steady and unyielding as if to say, "If only you knew." Without another sound, she stood, nudged the fabric one last time, and began to push the snow back into the hole, covering it up as though burying a secret she wasn't ready to share. The man watched in silence, his thoughts racing. There was no doubt in his mind now. This wasn't random. This dog wasn't just digging for the sake of it. Whatever lay beneath that snow carried a meaning, a memory, or maybe even a loss too great to bear. As she finished and turned to leave, the man called out softly, "Wait." But she didn't stop. Her pause carried her away into the darkness, leaving him alone with the cold wind, and a growing sense that he had just scratched the surface of something far bigger than he could understand. The following morning, the man couldn't shake the image of the German shepherd or the tattered fabric from his mind. It haunted him like a faint melody he couldn't forget. He found himself back at the window, staring at the park, replaying the events of the night before. What was buried beneath the snow, and why was that dog so protective of it? He didn't know why it mattered so much, but he felt an inexplicable pull to uncover the truth. By mid-afternoon, the snow had stopped, and the weak sunlight did little to warm the air. The man wrapped himself in his thickest coat and headed to the park. His boots crunched loudly as he approached the spot where the dog had been digging. The snow was packed tightly, but he could still make out the faint indentations from her paws. He stood there for a moment, his breath fogging in the air, before he knelt down and started digging with his hands. The cold bit at his fingers through his gloves, but he kept going, the memory of the dog's mournful eyes pushing him forward. After a few minutes, his fingers hit something soft yet solid. It was the same piece of fabric he had seen last night, now partially frozen to the ground. He carefully pulled it free and held it up to the light. It was a small blanket, frayed and faded, with patches of bright colors that had dulled over time. But what struck him most was the scent, a faint, lingering smell of something familiar yet out of place in the cold. Baby powder. His chest tightened as he realized this wasn't just any blanket. It was a child's. "What is this doing here?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked around, half expecting the dog to appear out of nowhere, watching him from the shadows. But she was nowhere to be seen. Clutching the blanket, he stood up and scanned the park. The quiet felt heavier now, as if the air itself carried a weight he couldn't name. His mind raced with questions. Had the dog belonged to a child? Was she mourning someone? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but before he could dwell on it further, a voice behind him made him jump. "You're looking for her, aren't you?" He spun around to see an older woman bundled in a thick coat, her sharp eyes fixed on the blanket in his hand. She stood a few feet away, her posture tense but curious. "Excuse me?" the man said, startled. "The dog," the woman said, stepping closer. "You've seen her, haven't you? The German shepherd?" "Yes," he said slowly, his grip tightening on the blanket. "Do you know her?" The woman sighed, her breath forming a cloud in the cold air. "She's been coming here for weeks, always to that spot, always digging." She paused, her expression softening. "You found something, didn't you?" The man hesitated, then held up the blanket. It was buried in the snow. The woman's eyes widened, and she let out a soft gasp. "I knew it," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "She's mourning." "Mourning?" the man echoed, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that made his stomach twist. "That blanket belonged to a little boy. He and the dog used to play here every day, even in the cold. They were inseparable." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "But last winter, there was an accident. A car skidded on the ice near the road. The boy didn't make it." The man felt his breath catch. "And the dog?" "She survived," the woman said, her voice barely audible. "But she's never been the same. She keeps coming back here to the spot where they used to sit together. I think she's searching for him, or maybe she's trying to hold on to the only piece of him she has left." The man stared at the blanket in his hands, his heart heavy with a grief that wasn't even his. He looked back at the woman, his voice trembling. "Why hasn't anyone helped her? Why hasn't someone taken her in?" "She won't let anyone get close," the woman said. "She's loyal, even in her grief. Maybe she thinks it's her fault. Maybe she thinks she has to stay here to protect his memory." The man's throat tightened as the weight of the story settled over him. He looked back at the park, the wind picking up and carrying the faintest sound of something that might have been a bark, or perhaps just his imagination. He knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. The dog had a story to tell, and he wasn't going to stop until he understood all of it. That night, the man couldn't sleep. The woman's words echoed in his mind, intertwining with the image of the German shepherd digging in the snow. He kept picturing her eyes, those haunting, sorrowful eyes, and the way she protected that blanket like it was all she had left in the world. He felt an ache in his chest that he couldn't ignore, a need to do something, though he wasn't sure what. By the time the clock struck midnight, he found himself pulling on his boots and coat, grabbing a flashlight and stepping into the freezing night. The park was silent, blanketed in fresh snow, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. He scanned the area, his breath clouding in front of him, hoping she would appear. And then there she was. She emerged from the darkness like a ghost, her fur glinting faintly under the dim light. She moved with the same quiet determination, heading straight for the familiar spot. The man stayed still, not wanting to scare her away, but his presence didn't seem to bother her. She glanced at him briefly before returning her focus to the ground, her paws resuming their nightly task. "Hey," he called out softly, stepping closer. "It's okay. I'm not here to stop you." She paused, her head tilting slightly as if trying to understand him. He crouched down a few feet away, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "I know about the boy," he said gently. "I know what happened." Her ears twitched, and for a moment he thought she might walk away. But then she sat down beside the half-dug hole, her eyes fixed on him. There was something in her gaze, a flicker of trust, perhaps, that gave him the courage to reach into his pocket. He pulled out the blanket, carefully folded, and held it out toward her. "I found this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is this what you've been looking for?" The dog's reaction was immediate. She leaned forward, sniffing the blanket, and let out a low, mournful whine that cut through the stillness of the night. Her nose nudged it gently, and she whimpered again, a sound so full of sorrow it made the man's throat tighten. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry you lost him." She looked up at him then, her amber eyes glistening with something that felt almost human. For the first time, she didn't seem guarded or distant. Instead, she seemed tired of carrying this weight alone. The man hesitated, then reached out slowly, placing the blanket in the hole she had been digging. "If this is where you want it," he said, "then I'll help you." Together they worked in silence. The man dug alongside her, his hands numb from the cold, while she watched him with quiet intensity. When the hole was deep enough, she carefully placed her paw on the blanket, as if giving her silent approval, before they covered it with snow. When it was done, she sat beside the spot, her head lowered, and let out a soft sigh that sounded almost like relief. The man stayed with her for a while, sitting in the snow and staring at the quiet park around them. He didn't know what to say, so he simply sat in silence, hoping his presence was enough. After a while, she stood, shook the snow from her fur, and looked at him one last time. There was gratitude in her eyes now, a quiet acknowledgement that he had helped her in some small way. As she turned to leave, the man called out, "Wait." She paused, looking back at him. "You don't have to keep coming here," he said. "You can let go. You deserve to be somewhere warm, somewhere safe." She stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, before she turned and disappeared into the shadows. He didn't try to follow her. Instead, he sat there, his heart heavy but full, knowing that even if she didn't come back, he had given her something she desperately needed, the chance to say goodbye. But deep down, he hoped this wasn't the end, because he wasn't sure who needed healing more, her or him. The following days felt strange for the man. Each time he passed the window, he found himself glancing at the park, half expecting to see her shadow moving through the snow. But the German shepherd didn't return. The silence weighed on him more than he cared to admit, leaving behind an emptiness that gnawed at him. He tried to focus on his routine, to push the thought of her from his mind, but it was no use. The questions lingered. Where had she gone? Was she still wandering the cold streets alone? Had she found a place to stay, or worse, had she given up entirely? The thought sent a pang of guilt through him. He should have done more, shouldn't have let her walk away. On the third night, just as the sky turned a deep indigo and snow began to fall again, there was a sound outside his door, a soft, hesitant scratch, barely audible over the howling wind. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. It couldn't be, could it? When he opened the door, the sight before him took his breath away. There she was, the German shepherd, sitting on his porch with snowflakes dusting her fur. But she wasn't alone. Beside her, huddled close for warmth, were two tiny puppies. Their fur was scruffy, their bodies thin, and their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. One of them shivered visibly, pressing against the shepherd's side for comfort. The man's chest tightened as he realized what he was seeing. She hadn't just been grieving all this time. She had been protecting. "Oh my God," he whispered, stepping outside despite the biting cold. "You brought them here." The German shepherd looked up at him, her eyes steady and full of quiet determination. There was no fear in her gaze now, only a plea. She nudged one of the puppies forward gently with her nose, as if to say, "They need you." The man knelt, his hands trembling as he reached out. The puppy flinched at first, but the shepherd gave a soft, reassuring bark, and the little one relaxed enough to let him scoop it into his arms. Its tiny body was cold and frail, but it snuggled into his chest, seeking warmth. The other puppy hesitated before following its sibling, and soon the man was holding both of them, their small bodies pressed against him as if they had finally found a safe haven. He looked back at the shepherd, his throat tight with emotion. "You trusted me," he said softly. "After everything, you brought them to me." She stepped closer, her nose brushing against his hand before she let out a soft sigh and sat down. The weight of her actions hit him like a tidal wave. She had been carrying this burden alone, grieving the boy she had lost, protecting these puppies, and somehow finding the strength to keep going despite it all. And now, she was asking him for help. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said, his voice shaking. "I'll take care of them. I'll take care of you." For a moment, the shepherd simply looked at him, her amber eyes searching his face. Then slowly, she stood and walked past him into the house. It was as if she had finally allowed herself to let go of the past, to trust that someone else could carry the weight she had borne for so long. The man followed her inside, closing the door behind them as the snow continued to fall outside. The warmth of the house enveloped them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the German shepherd lay down on a soft blanket near the fire, her puppies curling up beside her. As the man watched them, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known he needed. They had all found something that night: shelter, comfort, and perhaps a second chance. And as the puppies drifted off to sleep and the shepherd's eyes grew heavy, the man made a silent promise. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. But even as the fire crackled and the night deepened, one question lingered in his mind. Where had the puppies come from? And why did he have the feeling that the shepherd's story wasn't over yet? The morning sun streamed through the window, casting a golden glow over the small living room. The German shepherd lay curled up near the fire, her body rising and falling in a steady rhythm as she slept. Her two puppies were nestled against her side, their tiny snores filling the quiet air. The man stood in the kitchen watching them from a distance as he sipped his coffee. It was the first time in weeks that he felt a sense of warmth, a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. But his mind was restless. The sight of the puppies stirred too many questions. Where had they come from? Why had the shepherd waited so long to bring them here? And most importantly, had someone hurt them? Or her? As he placed his mug down, a faint knock at the door startled him. He glanced toward the sleeping dogs before moving to answer it. When he opened the door, he was met with a man in a worn jacket, his face weathered and lined, holding a crumpled flyer in his hand. "Morning," the stranger said, his voice gruff but polite. "I'm looking for a dog, a German shepherd. Seen one around here?" The man's chest tightened, his mind racing. "Why do you ask?" The stranger held up the flyer, which had a photo of a German shepherd that looked eerily similar to the one asleep by his fire. Beneath it, the words "Missing Family Dog, Reward Offered" were scrawled in bold letters. But what caught his attention was the date. The dog had been missing for almost a year. "She's mine," the stranger said, his tone growing firmer. "She disappeared after an accident. I've been looking for her ever since." The man's heart pounded. Could this really be her owner? And if so, why did it feel like something was off? He hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "What accident?" The stranger's face darkened, his gaze shifting. "It's none of your concern," he said sharply. "I just want my dog back." The man's grip tightened on the doorframe. Something about the way the stranger avoided his eyes, the way his voice grew harsher, set off alarm bells in his mind. "She's been through a lot," he said carefully. "And she's not alone, she has puppies." The stranger's eyes flickered with something, surprise, maybe, or anger. "Puppies?" he repeated, his tone hard to read. "She didn't have any when she went missing." The man's unease deepened. He stepped outside, closing the door slightly behind him, blocking the stranger's view of the inside. "If she's yours, how did she end up out here, all alone, in the middle of winter?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "What really happened?" The stranger scowled, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That's none of your business," he snapped. "She's my dog. That's all you need to know." "I don't think it is," the man shot back, his own voice growing steadier. "She's been grieving, she's been protecting those puppies, and you haven't told me a single reason to believe she'd be better off with you." The stranger stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Listen here, friend. You don't want to get involved in something that isn't yours to meddle in." The man squared his shoulders, meeting the stranger's glare. "And you don't want to test someone who cares about that dog more than you seem to." For a moment they stood in tense silence, the cold wind biting at their faces. Finally, the stranger shoved the flyer into the man's chest. "You're making a mistake," he muttered before turning and walking away, his boots crunching against the snow. The man stayed there for a moment, his heart racing. He unfolded the flyer and studied the photo again, his mind racing with doubts and questions. If the stranger was telling the truth, why had the shepherd run away? And if he wasn't, what kind of danger had she been escaping all this time? When he stepped back inside, the shepherd was awake, her eyes fixed on him. She must have heard the conversation, because the moment their eyes met, she let out a soft growl. Not aggressive, but protective, as if warning him of the threat she already sensed. "It's okay," he said softly, crouching down beside her. "I'm not letting anyone take you. Not until I know the truth." She leaned into him, her body relaxing slightly. But the tension in the room lingered. The man glanced at the puppies, now awake and watching him with wide, curious eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger would be back, and that the shepherd's story was far from over. He reached out and scratched behind her ears. "Whatever you're running from," he murmured, "we'll face it together. I promise." But as the hours passed and the sky darkened once more, he couldn't ignore the growing sense that trouble was closing in. The days turned into weeks, and the German shepherd and her puppies became a part of the man's life. He named the mother dog Luna, a fitting name, he thought, for someone who had wandered through the cold, lonely nights like a silent guardian. The puppies, now full of energy and life, were Scout and Daisy T, their playful antics filling the once quiet house with warmth and laughter. Luna had transformed, too. The weight in her eyes had lessened, replaced by a calm contentment. But there were still moments when she would sit by the window, staring out at the snow-covered park with a look that seemed to carry both longing and resolution. The man knew she hadn't forgotten the boy or the bond they'd shared, and neither had he. The tattered blanket remained folded neatly on a shelf, a quiet reminder of the past they both now carried. One evening, as the first signs of spring began to peek through the melting snow, the man decided to take Luna and the puppies to the park. It felt like the right thing to do, a way to honor where their journey had begun. The air was crisp, but the sun was warm, and as they reached the spot where Luna had once dug tirelessly, the man noticed something strange. A small bouquet of wildflowers rested on the ground, tied together with a simple blue ribbon. Luna froze, her body tense, her ears perked. She stepped forward cautiously, sniffing the flowers, then looked up at the man, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before. A quiet understanding. He knelt beside her, his hand resting on her back. "Someone remembers," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Someone else knows what happened here." Luna let out a soft bark, and for a moment it almost felt like she was agreeing with him. Together they sat by the flowers, the puppies tumbling around them in the grass. The man could feel the weight of the moment, the way it seemed to bridge the past and the present, tying their stories together in a way that felt both painful and healing. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the park, the man spoke softly, more to himself than to Luna. "I think you came into my life for a reason," he said. "You've carried so much pain, so much love, and you've shown me what it means to keep going, no matter how heavy the burden." Luna turned to him, her amber eyes meeting his. There was no sadness in her gaze now, only a quiet strength. It was as if she was telling him that she had found her peace, not by forgetting the boy, but by honoring his memory and moving forward with the new family she had found. The man smiled, his chest swelling with a bittersweet ache. "We'll make a new start together," he said. "You, me, Scout, and Daisy, and we'll never forget what brought us here." As they walked home under the fading light, Luna looked back at the park one last time. The bouquet of flowers swayed gently in the breeze, a silent tribute to a bond that would never be forgotten. And as the man glanced at her, he could see that she was no longer the same broken, grieving dog who had dug in the snow night after night. She was something more, stronger, freer, and filled with a quiet hope for the future. Back at the house, the puppies curled up together by the fire, their small snores filling the room. Luna lay beside them, her eyes heavy with sleep but her tail wagging softly against the floor. The man watched them, a deep sense of peace settling over him. In that moment, he realized something profound. Grief didn't have to mean the end. It could be a beginning, a chance to grow, to heal, and to find love again. And in their own way, Luna and her puppies had taught him that. As the fire crackled and the world outside grew dark, the man whispered, "Thank you, Luna." She opened one eye, her tail wagging slightly in response, before drifting off into a peaceful sleep. And for the first time in a long time, the man felt whole, like he too had found his place, his family, and his reason to keep moving forward.